Karl Marx has had more impact on actual events as well as on the minds of men than any other intellectual in modern times. The unfortunate reason for this is not primarily the attraction of his concepts and methodology, though both have had a strong appeal to unrigorous minds, but the fact that his philosophy has been institutionalized in two of the world's largest countries, Russia and China, and their many satellites. In this sense, he resembles St. Augustine, whose writings were most widely read among church leaders from the 5th to the 13th centuries, therefore playing a predominant role in the shaping of medieval Christendom. But the influence of Marx has been even more direct, since the kind of personal dictatorship he envisioned for himself, as we shall see, was actually carried into effect, with incalculable consequences for mankind, by his three most important followers, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao Zedong, all of whom in this respect were faithful Marxists. Marx was a child of his time, the mid-19th century, and Marxism was a characteristic 19th century philosophy in that it claimed to be scientific. Scientific was Marx's strongest expression of approval, which he habitually used to distinguish himself from his many enemies. Unfortunately for posterity, his work was very unscientific. He felt that he had found an explanation of human behavior and history akin to Darwin's theory of evolution. The notion that Marxism is a science, in a way no other philosophy has ever been or could be, is implanted in the public doctrine of the states his followers founded, so that it colors the teaching of all subjects in their schools and universities. This has spilled over into the non-Marxist world for intellectuals, especially academics, and the identification of Marxism with massive physical authority has tempted many teachers to admit Marxist science to their own disciplines, especially such inexact or quasi-exact subjects as economics, sociology, history, and geography. The first thing we must ask about Marx, therefore, is, to what extent was he engaged in the pursuit of objective knowledge by the careful search for and evaluation of evidence? On the face of it, Marx's biography reveals him as primarily a scholar. He was descended on both sides from lines of academics. His father, Heinrich Marx, a lawyer, whose name originally was Herschel Halevi Marx, was the son of a rabbi and Talmudic scholar, descended from the famous rabbi Eleazar Halevi of Mainz, whose son Jehuda Mintz was head of the Talmudic school of Padua. Marx's mother, Henrietta Pressburg, was the daughter of a rabbi likewise descended from famous scholars and sages. Marx was born in Trier, then Prussian territory, on the 5th of May 1818, one of 9 children but the only son to survive into middle age. The family was quintessentially bourgeois middle class, and it was rising in the world. The father was a liberal and described himself as a real 18th century Frenchman. He read Voltaire and Rousseau inside out. Following a Prussian decree of 1816 which banned Jews from the higher ranks of law and medicine, he became a Protestant and on the 26th of August 1824 had 6 of his children baptized. Marx was confirmed at 15 and for a time seems to have been a passionate Christian. Karl became a good classical scholar and later specialized in philosophy, in the prevailing Hegelian mode. He took a doctorate but from Jena University, which had lower standards than Berlin. He never seems to have been quite good enough to get an academic post, however. In 1842 he became a journalist with the Rheinische Zeitung and edited it for 5 months until it was banned in 1843. Thereafter he wrote for the Deutsch Französische Jahrbucher and other journals in Paris until his expulsion in 1848. Thereafter he became involved in organizing the Communist League and wrote its manifesto in 1848. After the failure of the revolution, he was forced to move and settle in London in 1849, this time for good. From the 1850s through the 1870s, he was again involved in revolutionary politics, running the International Working Men's Association. But most of his time in London until his death on the 14th March 1883, that is some 35 years, was spent in the British Museum, milling about, finding material for a gigantic study of capital, and trying to get it into publishable shape. He saw 1 volume through the press in 1867, but the second and third were compiled from his notes by his colleague Friedrich Engels and published after his death. Marx then led a scholar's life. He once complained that he was a machine condemned to devour books, but in a deeper sense he was not really a scholar and not a scientist at all. He was not interested in finding the truth, but in proclaiming it. There were 3 strands in Marx: the poet, the journalist, and then the moralist. Each was important, and together they combined with his enormous will to make a formidable writer and seer. But there was nothing scientific about him. Indeed, in all matters, he was anti-scientific. Marx found his true form as a journalist, and in some ways he was a good one. Marx found planning, let alone writing, a major book not only difficult but impossible. Even Das Kapital is a series of essays glued together without any real form. But he was well suited to write short, sharp, opinionated reactions to events as they occurred. He believed, as his poetic imagination told him, that society was on the verge of collapse. So almost every big news story could be related to this general principle, giving his journalism a remarkable consistency. Journalistic aphorisms became the highlights of Marx's work. Its ballast was academic jargon. Over time, Marx became a failed academic, and as an embittered would-be Don, he wanted to astonish the world by founding a new philosophical school, which was also a plan of action designed to give him power. Hence his ambivalent attitude towards Hegel. Marx says in his preface to the second German edition of Kapital, "I frankly proclaimed myself as a disciple of that great thinker, and toyed with the use of Hegelian terminology when discussing the theory of value. But," he said, his own dialectical method was in direct opposition to Hegel's. For Hegel, the thought process is the creator of the real, whereas in my view, on the other hand, the ideal is nothing more than the material when it has been transposed and translated inside the human head. Hence, he argued, in Hegel's writings, dialectic stands on its head. Marx then sought academic fame by what he saw as his sensational discovery of the fatal flaw in Hegel's method, which enabled him to replace the entire Hegelian system with a new philosophy. Indeed, a super-philosophy which would make all existing philosophies outmoded. But he continued to accept that Hegel's dialectic was the key to human understanding, and he not only used it but remained its prisoner till the end of his life. But what has this to do with the politics and economics of the real world? Nothing whatsoever. Just as the origin of Marx's philosophy lay in a quasi-religious vision, so its elaboration was an exercise in academic jargonizing. What it needed, however, to set Marx's intellectual machinery into motion was a moral impulse, and this moral impulse eventually became politicized within the structure of his thought. Even when Marx goes on to politicize events, he still uses philosophical jargon. Quote, "Socialism cannot be brought into existence without revolution. When the organizing activity begins, when the soul, the thing in itself, appears, then socialism can toss aside all the political veils." Marx was a true Victorian. He underlined words as often as Queen Victoria herself in her letters, but his underlying does not actually help much to convey his meaning, which remains sunk in the obscurity of the concepts of German academic philosophy. Marx often resorted to habitual giganticism, stressing the global nature of the process he was describing, but this too was cumbered by the jargon. Thus, the proletariat can only exist world historically, just as communism in its actions can only have world historical existence, or communism is empirically only possible as the act of the ruling people all at once and simultaneously, which presupposes the universal development of productive power and the world commerce which depends on it. Obscure commentaries, to be sure. However, even when Marx's meaning is clear, his statements do not necessarily have any validity. They are no more than obiter dicta of a moral philosopher. Some of the sentences I've quoted above would sound equally plausible or implausible if they were altered to say the opposite. Where then were the facts, the evidence from the real world, to turn these prophetic utterances of a moral philosopher, quasi-religionist, these revelations, into a science? Marx always had an ambivalent attitude to facts, as he had to Hegel's philosophy. On the one hand, he spent entire decades of his life amassing facts, which accumulated in over 100 enormous notebooks. But these were the facts to be found in libraries, blue book facts. The kind of facts which did not interest Marx were the facts to be discovered by examining the world and the people who live in it with his own eyes and ears. He was totally and incorrigibly desk-bound. Nothing on earth would get him out of a library and the study. His interest in poverty and exploitation went back to the autumn of 1842, when he was just 24 and wrote a series of articles on the laws governing the right of local peasants to gather wood. According to Engels, Marx told him it was his study of the law concerning the theft of wood and his investigation of the Moselle peasantry which turned his attention from mere politics to economic conditions and thus to socialism. But there is no evidence that Marx actually talked to these peasants or looked at the conditions on the spot. Again, in 1844, he wrote for the financial weekly Vorwärts, or Forward, on an article on the plight of the Silesian weavers. But he never went to Silesia, or, for as far as we know, ever talked to a weaver of any description. It would have been very uncharacteristic of him if he had.